In late January 1945, as the Pacific War neared its brutal climax, a decision was made by the Japanese military to evacuate a group of elderly civilians from the northern islands of the archipelago. The evacuees were not soldiers or officials, but fragile men and women, some in their 80s, whose homes had been destroyed by bombing raids and whose families had either perished or disappeared. They were promised safe transport to a quieter region inland, far from the front lines. Many boarded the ship without fully understanding where they were going. They clutched worn cloth bundles and family photographs, stepping onto rusted decks with quiet obedience and deeply rooted fear. The ship chosen for the journey was an aging coastal freighter, hastily converted into a transport vessel. Its hull was streaked with rust, the engines groaned with every churn, and faded red crosses had been painted on the sides to mark it as non-combatant. Inside, the passengers sat on crates, bundled in layers of thin clothing against the bitter sea wind. There were no medical staff, no heaters, no clean bedding. Just a skeletal crew, a few barrels of rice, and a distant hope of reaching safer ground. As the vessel set out into the cold waters of the East China Sea, the mood on board was subdued. Conversations were hushed, and most of the elderly passengers simply stared at the horizon. Some coughed violently, others murmured quiet prayers. A few elderly women tried to keep spirits up, offering warm water and bits of preserved fruit. But with each passing mile, the sea grew colder, and the clouds darker. On the third morning, as the ship passed through a narrow channel flanked by rocky shoals, the calm was shattered. A flight of Allied aircraft appeared overhead, fast and low. The red crosses on the ship were visible but weather-worn, and in the chaos of war, mistaken identities were common. Within moments, the silence was pierced by the whine of engines and the scream of falling shells. The crew tried to signal, but it was too late. Two direct hits tore through the vessel. One struck the forward deck, sending debris and bodies into the air. The second exploded in the engine room, cutting power and igniting flames. Panic erupted. Passengers screamed, stumbled, and fell as smoke and seawater flooded the corridors. Some of the crew tried to launch lifeboats, but the mechanisms were jammed with ice and corrosion. Elderly men and women clung to each other, many too frail to move quickly. Some jumped into the sea, instinct taking over. Others remained frozen on the deck, too confused or terrified to act. Among them was Akiko Inoue, a former schoolteacher, who had spent the voyage comforting the others. She grabbed the arms of two trembling women and guided them toward a broken section of railing. When the ship lurched again, she jumped. The water was unforgiving. Temperatures hovered just above freezing, and the shock of impact alone was enough to rob breath from the lungs. Survivors flailed in the waves, clinging to floating debris. Some went under almost immediately. Others drifted, eyes glazed, mouths open in silent gasps. Above them, the smoke curled into the sky, marking the grave of a ship that had left harbor with no intention of ever becoming a battlefield. From the distance, an American naval vessel spotted the plume. The crew initially assumed it to be another sunken transport, or perhaps a mine detonation. But as they drew closer, their binoculars revealed an unthinkable scene. Not soldiers in uniform, but elderly civilians floating in the wreckage. There were no weapons, no cries of defiance, just fragile bodies, barely moving, waiting to be claimed by the sea. Aboard the USS Stratton, alarms were sounded. Officers debated whether this was a trap, a feint, or a legitimate humanitarian crisis. But it didn't take long before a decision was made. The divers were called. The ship adjusted course. And as cold wind whipped across the deck, the men prepared to dive into waters that held more than just wreckage. They held the last chance for 50 lives hanging by a thread. The final voyage of that broken Japanese transport was meant to be quiet, anonymous, and unremarkable. But in the icy waves of the East China Sea, it became something else entirely. A silent cry for mercy in a world torn apart by vengeance. And somewhere beneath the dark surface, that cry would soon be answered. On the bridge of the USS Stratton, the sea stretched out in all directions, gray, bitter, and unforgiving. The crew was on high alert after receiving a fragmented radio transmission intercepted from an Allied reconnaissance aircraft. The message was vague: signs of wreckage, possible survivors, uncertain classification. No one was certain what they were heading into. Some feared it might be an enemy trap, a ruse to draw the ship into a torpedo zone or a mined corridor. The decision to investigate fell to Commander Harris, a seasoned officer who'd seen both deception and disaster at sea. He ordered the ship to reduce speed and adjust course toward the smoke plume barely visible on the horizon. The ocean was restless, and the wind howled across the deck, carrying the sharp scent of oil and salt. As the Stratton moved closer, binoculars revealed human figures drifting amidst broken timbers. There was no sign of weapons, uniforms, or resistance, only limp bodies and the desperate flicker of movement. Below deck, Lieutenant Edward Holland and his team of Navy divers were already preparing. These were men trained for demolition, salvage, and deepwater rescue, but this mission was different. The cold was the first enemy. The water temperature hovered near freezing, and exposure beyond 10 minutes could result in irreversible damage. Each diver suited up in heavy neoprene, their breath steaming in the cold air, hearts racing with adrenaline and uncertainty. Lieutenant Holland gathered his team for a final check. There were no guarantees about what they would find below. Sunken compartments, entangled rigging, sharp metal edges, and perhaps bodies. But there was also the possibility of survivors, trapped in air pockets, holding on in the dark. Holland reminded them of that chance. However small, it was worth everything. As the first launch boat entered the wreck zone, the smell of burning diesel and scorched timber hit hard. Floating debris surrounded them, shattered crates, torn life vests, pieces of hull, and among them the unmistakable forms of people. Elderly men and women in soaked robes, faces waxen, limbs motionless. Some were already gone. Others blinked slowly, barely conscious, clutching anything that floated. Petty Officer Franklin reached into the water to pull a man toward the boat. His skin was pale blue, and his breathing was shallow, but he was alive. Another crewman helped lift a woman whose back was cut from a fall, but who still muttered softly in Japanese. There was no panic in their eyes, only confusion and cold, as if they couldn't quite believe they had been found. One of them wept silently as a blanket was wrapped around his shoulders. From the deck, medics shouted instructions. Stretchers were readied. Blankets, oxygen tanks, and warm fluids were brought out in crates. The recovered civilians were carried aboard with trembling limbs and blank stares. No one resisted. No one spoke of the enemy. The line between sides had blurred into the universal instinct to survive. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Holland and Sergeant Louis Martinez prepared for the dive. They reviewed a rough diagram of the ship's class and estimated the most likely areas where air pockets could have formed. Time was the true enemy now. Every passing minute meant colder water and less hope for anyone still inside. With final checks complete, they stepped to the edge and disappeared beneath the surface. The water was black and heavy. Visibility dropped within moments. Their lights cut narrow beams through the gloom, illuminating twisted metal, drifting cloth, and glimmers of shattered glass. The wreck had settled at a steep angle, half submerged, half broken. Moving with care, they made their way toward a partially collapsed compartment where they believed passengers might be trapped. Inside, the silence was complete. Holland's hand gripped a beam as he peered into the flooded corridor. A shape floated toward him, a child's sandal. Then another, a pair of hands pressed weakly against a window, fogged from the inside. He signaled to Martinez. Someone was still alive. They had minutes, maybe less, to reach them. The rescue had begun in earnest. Above and below, the USS Stratton and her crew turned from warriors into lifelines. No longer chasing victory, they were racing the clock. And in the coldest waters of war, they began to rediscover something deeper than survival: human connection. The frigid sea swallowed Lieutenant Holland and Sergeant Martinez as they descended into the wreck. Their flashlights cut through the dense water like razors, revealing twisted metal beams, torn insulation, and shattered panels drifting in the current. The cold gripped every inch of their bodies, despite the layers of gear. Each breath through the regulator was shallow and loud, echoing in their helmets like a ticking clock. Visibility was limited to mere feet, and every shadow could be either a survivor or a snare. The ship had settled awkwardly on the seafloor, its midsection buckled inward. Holland led the way, careful to avoid loose cables and sharp fragments jutting from the walls. They moved through tight corridors where the floor had become the ceiling, and doorways were now jagged holes. The spaces reeked of fuel and rot. Patches of air were visible behind sealed doors, possible pockets where life might still linger. Their first discovery came in the form of a faint tapping. It was barely perceptible, but distinct, an uneven human rhythm. Holland followed the sound to a storage compartment partially crushed by the collapse. He pried open the door with a crowbar, forcing a narrow gap. Inside, two figures huddled together in near darkness: an elderly woman and a younger man, perhaps her son. Their faces were pale, eyes blinking slowly against the flashlight's glare. Martinez squeezed in and helped steady the woman as she was coaxed out of the chamber. She mouthed something, perhaps a name, perhaps a prayer. The young man clung to her hand but struggled to move. Holland gestured for assistance, and they carefully navigated him through the corridor, mindful of every jagged surface. Behind them, the woman sobbed softly, her voice muffled by the water and the weight of fear. They brought the pair to the surface, breaking through the waves as crewmen reached down to pull them into the rescue skiff. Blankets were wrapped around them instantly. Medics administered warm saline drips while checking for signs of hypothermia. The woman's lips were blue, and her hands trembled uncontrollably, but she was alive. The young man had a gash on his head and shallow breathing. Still, there was hope. Holland and Martinez dove again. This time, they headed toward the aft compartments, where other passengers might have sought shelter. The deeper they went, the more twisted the wreck became. Hallways narrowed, ceilings sagged under pressure. Time worked against them. Not only the limits of their oxygen, but the structural integrity of the ship itself, which groaned and creaked like a living thing in pain. In the galley, they found 3 more survivors huddled beneath an overturned table. One of them had broken ribs and was barely conscious. They stabilized him with makeshift splints using belt straps and kitchen utensils. The other 2 clung to each other for warmth. As they emerged with the new group, the ship groaned again, louder this time, a warning that the wreck might not hold much longer. The divers surfaced to find more skiffs shuttling between the Stratton and the wreck site. A steady chain of sailors worked to haul bodies and debris from the water. Some were silent, already beyond saving. Others groaned weakly, eyes fluttering open when a warm hand touched their shoulder. The deck of the Stratton had transformed into a triage zone, lined with the injured and the shivering. Holland gave a brief report to Commander Harris, noting the areas already searched and those still inaccessible. He asked for one more dive. Harris hesitated. The ship was shifting dangerously, and the temperature had dropped again. But he nodded. Holland didn't argue. He knew that if even one more person was alive, he couldn't leave them behind. As he prepared for what could be the final dive, Holland noticed something unusual in Martinez's expression, an intensity deeper than duty. Later, he would learn that Martinez had lost his own grandmother in a wartime evacuation years earlier. For him, this wasn't just about orders, it was personal. And in that icy water, surrounded by broken steel and fragile bodies, he was fighting to rewrite one small part of that past. The sea was unforgiving, the wreck unstable, and the cold relentless. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that there were still voices in the dark, breaths in the silence, hands waiting to be found. And as long as they were down there, Holland and Martinez would keep diving. By dawn the following day, the wreck site had become a solemn operation zone. Dozens of rescued civilians now lay on stretchers across the deck of the USS Stratton, wrapped in every available blanket, towel, and coat. The ship's galley was converted into a makeshift medical bay. Hot broth simmered in vats, and the scent of antiseptic began to replace that of diesel and seawater. The Stratton's crew, many of whom had never seen a civilian casualty up close, worked without rest. The medical team, led by Lieutenant Dr. Simon Lang, faced a challenge unlike any battlefield trauma. These weren't combat wounds. They were the slow, creeping afflictions of exposure, dehydration, and shock. Most of the survivors had dangerously low core temperatures, and many were slipping into unconsciousness. Lang issued orders with precision: warm IV fluids, oxygen therapy, slow rewarming. He reminded the crew that moving too fast could trigger cardiac arrest. Language was an immediate barrier. The elderly Japanese passengers tried to speak but were met with blank stares until Sergeant Martinez stepped forward. He crouched beside each patient, introducing himself in soft Japanese, explaining what the doctors were doing. Some wept upon hearing their own language. Others clutched his hand and asked for news of their families. Martinez became a bridge not only of words but of trust. Below deck, exhausted divers returned one by one, lips blue, fingers stiff. Lieutenant Holland's last dive had nearly ended in disaster. An internal corridor collapsed as he searched it, forcing him to retreat through a breach in the hull. Still, he insisted on reviewing the footage captured from helmet cams, mapping out areas where survivors might still be trapped. His body trembled from cold and fatigue, but his resolve hadn't wavered. On the third dive that morning, a new discovery was made. Petty Officer Garrett spotted an interior stairwell that led to a sealed compartment. The door was wedged shut, but air bubbles floated through a jagged crack. With help from 2 other divers, they pried it open. Inside, they found 5 survivors, 4 men and 1 woman, curled in silence around an overturned table. One man had a fractured leg, another had drifted in and out of consciousness, but they were alive. The rescue effort reached its emotional peak when a crewman named Ensign Talbot carried an unconscious woman onto the deck. She was in her 80s, wrapped in a waterlogged kimono, her hair matted with seaweed. A younger sailor, barely 20, gently wiped her face and whispered reassurances, even though she couldn't hear them. When she finally stirred and opened her eyes, she looked up at him and smiled faintly. That single moment brought tears to half the deck. The Stratton sailors, hardened by war, found themselves doing unfamiliar tasks, feeding soup to trembling hands, wrapping bandages on paper-thin skin, and bowing awkwardly to show respect. Some even removed their boots before entering the designated shelter space, unsure if it was correct, but understanding that dignity mattered. They treated each rescued soul not as an enemy, but as someone's mother, father, or grandparent. As word of the operation spread through the fleet via encoded transmission, the rescue gained quiet attention. Command offered no directives beyond "continue mission." Supplies were rerouted to the Stratton, more medical gear, food, and translators. For the first time in weeks, the ship was not preparing for battle, but for care. It became, briefly, a sanctuary adrift in a sea of chaos. One poignant scene played out late that night. A rescued woman who had been silent for hours suddenly began singing a lullaby. No one understood the words, but the melody was soft and fragile. It filled the air like a prayer, cutting through exhaustion and pain. A few sailors stopped to listen, heads bowed. In that moment, war felt distant, and something else, something deeper, took its place. The sea had claimed the ship, but it had not claimed everyone aboard. The Stratton, battered and overburdened, had become a vessel not of destruction, but of life. Each rescued breath, each cup of broth, each quiet gesture reminded the crew that sometimes the most powerful act in war is not the fight, but the rescue. In the days following the rescue, the USS Stratton remained anchored near the wreck site, surrounded by scattered debris and the stillness of a sea that had momentarily calmed. The war still raged hundreds of miles away, but here the atmosphere had shifted. The crew moved with a gentler rhythm, focused not on combat drills or torpedo checks, but on distributing meals, checking bandages, and listening to the soft breathing of the elderly passengers sleeping in rows below deck. Silence had replaced alarm bells. The ship had become something entirely unexpected, a floating haven. Lieutenant Holland, still nursing a shoulder injury from the collapsed corridor, spent his time cataloging the rescued. He went bunk to bunk, asking Martinez to help him record names, approximate ages, and any fragments of their home villages. It became clear that many of these people had been displaced long before the shipwreck, victims not only of a sinking transport, but of years of slow erasure by war. Some had no family left. Others whispered names, barely audible, as if afraid the sea might still hear and claim them. Petty Officer Franklin took it upon himself to write letters in English to accompany these names, short messages to be translated and delivered if anyone in Japan ever came looking. He folded each letter carefully, placing it in a waterproof envelope. He admitted later in his journal that he doubted any would reach their intended recipients. Still, he wrote them, not because he expected a reply, but because no one deserved to disappear without a trace. The sailors began forming quiet connections with those they had saved. One young crewman shaved an old man's beard with such care it moved Dr. Lang to tears. Another brought paper and charcoal to an elderly woman who spent her hours sketching scenes from the wreck: the cracked hull, the broken stairwell, a rescuer's flashlight. Her hands trembled, but her lines were steady. She gave the drawings to the crew, calling them memory gifts. Meals were simple, but served with reverence. Rice salvaged from emergency rations, dried fish warmed over burners, and small squares of chocolate, the latter being a revelation to many of the rescued. A few of the elders cried after tasting it, confused by the sweetness, their eyes shining with emotion. Food, in this setting, was no longer nourishment alone. It was reconciliation, offered not by diplomats, but by ordinary men. One day, Akiko Inoue, the former schoolteacher, stood on the deck under a clear morning sky. She was weak but steady, and with Martinez translating, she asked if she could speak to the crew. Gathered in quiet formation, the sailors listened as she bowed deeply and thanked them. Her voice was hoarse, but her words were clear. She said they had saved not only bodies, but something more: dignity, memory, and the belief that compassion could exist even in war. After her speech, Commander Harris gathered the crew privately. He told them there would be no medals for this mission, no headlines or commendations. The war would not pause to acknowledge what they had done. But he reminded them that sometimes the things that matter most are the ones never written into reports. What they had done here, he said, would outlive the war itself. That evening, the Stratton received orders to return to its fleet group. The time had come to resume operations. But before departing, the crew and the civilians held a joint ceremony on the main deck. A small wooden plaque, engraved by one of the engineers, was nailed to the bulkhead. It read, 50 rescued from silence. Let no one forget. Flowers made from folded paper were placed beside it, delicate and fluttering in the wind. The old and the young stood side by side. No flags were raised, no anthems played. Only the sound of the sea and the quiet presence of those who had nearly vanished beneath it. For the crew of the Stratton, the ceremony marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, one where enemy and ally no longer mattered, and only the simple act of saving a life carried weight. As the engines rumbled back to life and the ship began to pull away from the wreck site, many of the rescued leaned against the rails, watching the water that had nearly taken them. Some murmured prayers. Others simply closed their eyes, feeling the warmth of the rising sun on their faces. And aboard that ship, war's edge had softened, just enough to let humanity breathe. News of the rescue aboard the USS Stratton did not travel fast or far. Officially, it remained a footnote in a larger operation log, overshadowed by ongoing offensives and the strategic grind of war. But among the ships nearby, and later within quiet corners of the naval network, the story passed from sailor to sailor. It was told not with fanfare, but with a strange reverence, like something sacred had occurred in the icy sea. It wasn't a victory, but it felt like one. Back in Japan, after the war ended, most of the survivors returned to lives changed beyond recognition. Cities they once called home had been reduced to rubble, and family names they whispered in the infirmary had vanished from registers. But those 50 men and women carried something rare into that broken world, a memory not of cruelty or loss, but of hands that pulled instead of pushed. They told their stories to children and grandchildren, speaking not of heroism, but of kindness. Akiko Inoue kept the drawings made aboard the Stratton in a small box for the rest of her life. Each year, on the anniversary of the sinking, she lit incense and placed a single folded paper flower on her windowsill, facing east. When asked why she did it, she would simply say, "For the boy with the flashlight. He showed me the way out." She never learned his name, but his memory became part of her rhythm, a quiet tether to that impossible morning. Years later, a delegation of U.S. Navy veterans organized a visit to Japan. Among them were former sailors from the Stratton, older now, slower, some with canes and hearing aids. Through a translator, they requested a visit to a small seaside town in Miyagi Prefecture, where several survivors had resettled. There, they were greeted by families holding faded photographs and carefully preserved letters. No one spoke the same language, but everyone understood. A small stone monument had already been placed on a bluff overlooking the Pacific, erected by the town's elders. It bore no political symbol, only 2 sets of carved characters, one in English, one in Japanese. It read, "The sea divided us. The sea returned us. We remember." Flowers, both real and paper, surrounded it. Some were weathered by years of wind. Others looked freshly made. Sergeant Martinez, now retired, stood silently in front of the stone. He placed a folded letter at its base, sealed in plastic. Inside was a photo of an elderly woman holding a sailor's hand aboard a ship. He had never seen her again after the war, but he remembered how tightly she had clutched him, not out of fear, but something closer to belief. That evening, under a setting sun, the veterans and villagers shared a meal. Fish grilled over open flames, rice wrapped in seaweed, small cups of warm tea passed hand to hand. No speeches were given. Instead, people exchanged glances, nods, tears. One of the Stratton men offered a piece of chocolate to a wide-eyed child. The gesture needed no explanation. In the years that followed, the story of the rescue was occasionally told at naval academies, not as a tactical operation, but as an example of duty without aggression. The divers' logs, the doctor's notes, and handwritten accounts were archived in a folder labeled Stratton Humanitarian Response 1945. Few cadets opened it, but those who did often paused after reading, silent for a while, before closing the file with a sense of quiet awe. The ocean forgets quickly. Waves erase wakes. Storms scatter wreckage. Time smooths the scars left by ships and men. But some moments, once pulled from its depths, refuse to be lost again. They echo in the memory of those who were saved and those who saved them. And somewhere in that cold sea, where a ship once broke and 50 lives almost vanished, the silence still holds a trace of voices, gentle, desperate, grateful, rising toward the surface. In the end, the rescue aboard the USS Stratton did not change the course of the war, but it changed people. It proved that even when all odds are against life, the choice to reach into darkness matters. It showed that mercy can be stronger than fear. And it left behind a truth too quiet for headlines, but too powerful to ever be forgotten.